Welcome to this session of Converge 2021. My name is Charmaine Roche and I will be co-presenting this session with my research collaborator, Professor Jonathan Passmore. We have co-authored the research report, Racial Justice, Equity and Belonging in Coaching. And through the publication of this report, we will be making a call to action to the coaching world. At the core of our report is an exploration of this question: what does the coaching ecosystem need to become anti-racist? Our report makes three challenges to the world of coaching. We challenge the world of coaching to acknowledge the presence of systemic racism within the coaching ecosystem, to end the current collusive neutrality of colourblindness that dominates the profession, and to adopt an anti-racist approach. I will now hand over to Jonathan, who will talk about the global context for our research project and the methodology.
Thanks, Charmaine. So I think it's really important when we share with you the research to talk a little bit about the context in which we were undertaking this research project. And if we look back on this two-year project that Charmaine and I embarked on, there were a number of significant global events that impacted on the perceptions of our participants and equally how we were thinking about and framing our research. And it's important to recognize that how the issue of race plays out in different cultural contexts is a significant factor to how individual participants experience and describe their experiences in relation to our study. So, of course, a significant factor was the murder of George Floyd that led to significant protests in the United States, the emergence and focus on the Black Lives Matter protests, and that had ripples that spread out across the pond. We saw experiences in the United Kingdom where there were street protests, and in the city of Bristol where statues were toppled of slave traders, and a real interest and debate beginning to grow around the issues of slavery and empire. We also saw in many sporting contexts, whether that's football players, whether that is Formula One, individuals responding to this debate, taking the knee, and also engaging in what do they need to be doing as an anti-racist response to their profession, to how they were conducting themselves, and that wider debate in relation to their society and how they saw themselves. And on an academic perspective, a great number of publications emerging. We have one example of that here. Me and white supremacy, beginning to think about and helping individuals to encounter their own journeys, to start thinking about the implications for themselves, their practices, and the work that we as individuals need to do to help us to begin to think about and to adopt a positive approach to this challenging issue. So given that global context, I'd like to talk a little bit then about some of the context in relation to the privilege and wealth gap that we see across society. And this is well known, and many research studies have identified that particular challenge, that when we look at issues, both in relation to gender and in relation to race, that we see inequality. And that has been well reported in multiple research publications and in popular media outlets, whether that's the Guardian newspaper, Forbes website, and there are others too, providing us evidence around the gap that exists in our society. It's real and it's well known, and we see that this affects both gender as well as race. Of course, that raises the question around the coaching arena. And there has been an assumption, well, coaching might be a little bit different. We see when we have done research that actually the balance in coaching in terms of representation seems to be approximately and it varies country to country, around about 2/3 of professional coaches are women, and around 1/3 of professional coaches are men. But some research that I undertook in 2017 not only confirmed that gender balance of 65-35 approximately, as I say, varying in different countries, but what it also revealed was a gender inequality in relation to the rates of pay. So while there were more women, what we noticed from the data that we collected from this research study was that the pay rates that women commanded in coaching were lower than those commanded by men. So that raised the question, well, how could this be explained? Was that to do with male coaches having more experience, higher qualifications, more engaging in supervision practice? Maybe their ICF or other credentialing was at a higher standing. Actually, when we controlled for all of those factors, none of them explained the gender gap. The only explanation that we found in the data was simply gender was the determinant in the rate of pay. Now, that was interesting. Maybe that just reflects that wider gap that we see in society, that when men and women come forward to ask for pay rates or are expecting a salary in a working place, we see that that pay gap exists, and coaching was no different from that. Now, when we then looked in the 2021 Global Coaching Survey, we also explored the issue around racial inequalities. Was there a gap that existed here? And just taking two specific examples of the United Kingdom and the United States, what we found was that that gap in terms of pay that women experienced from the research we did in 2017 was played out in relation to race. In short, Black coaches were paid less than white coaches, and interestingly, dual heritage coaches, individuals who were maybe a combination of different heritages, they were somewhere in the middle. So they were paid more than Black coaches on average, but lower than white coaches. Now, this is quite alarming, and that data, when we looked at the sample sizes, we were able to confirm that it was statistically significant. So we have very strong data that confirms for the first time that there is such a gap in relation not only to gender, but that also relates to race. And at the same time, when we looked at the racial makeup of the Global Coaching Survey, what was also interesting is that the number of Black and Asian coaches, when we looked at a national level, were underrepresented when compared with the population for that individual country. So some interesting issues playing out in terms of how coaching seems to mirror what we're seeing in wider society. It isn't a special case. It seems to mirror what we see in many other aspects, many other industries. So for this study, what we were seeking to do was to explore multi-stakeholder perspectives and listen to the voices from those who made up the coaching industry, members from BIPOC, and we chose 4 specific geographical locations, recognizing that the issue of race plays out in different ways, reflecting the history of slavery and of empire and of national policies and cultures in those individual locations. So we took the United States, we took the United Kingdom, but we also looked at New Zealand and Maori people in New Zealand, and we also looked at Africa and engaged with BIPOC in each of these geographical locations. And then as recognizing that actually coaching as a sector is made up of other voices too, we engaged with coach educators from private providers to universities, coaching service providers, organizations, consultancy, organizations who are providing coaching services, coaching platforms, and we engaged with professional bodies, global bodies who represent thousands of members across the world. And then, having engaged in those interviews, we conducted a qualitative study using thematic analysis. As I was suggesting, this project in terms of engagement was 18 months. And so really during that whole period of time, gathering, engaging and reflecting on the data that from these multiple stakeholder groups And as two researchers, we recognized that alone we didn't want to bring our perspectives. We wanted to draw upon the advice from a wide range of perspectives to help us navigate our way through what is a complex issue. So in front of you here is the slide of our advisory group, drawn from colleagues in the United States and New Zealand and the UK and from Africa, who provided us with advice during this process. And in addition to this specific advisory group, we've actively engaged with diversity and inclusion specialists to help us think through some of the complex issues that are emerging and how we might engage with the data that we had been gathering and how we might make sense of that as a way of developing a series of recommendations that might help us collectively as an industry move forward together.
So I'm now going to take us through on a tour through the research evidence and the themes that arose out of the analysis of the interviews that I conducted with the coaches and the professional associations and the data that Jonathan collected from the coach training organisations and coach providers. It's important to say at this point, just to kind of emphasise some of the points that Jonathan has raised, that we are focusing specifically on systemic racism, not on individual racism, race hate, or race violence, which are the most extreme forms of racism, but on the everyday, almost mundane practices and policies, structures and systems that embody a pattern of hierarchy, racial hierarchy, which has grown out of the historic process of the racialization of people. People of Black people, Indigenous people, people of colour, and white-skinned people also have been racialized under this system. In taking this tour of the data and the themes that arose from it, I will make reference to the three challenges that were introduced at the top of this presentation. So in terms of the acknowledgement of the presence of systemic racism within the coaching ecosystem, Jonathan has already referred to the race-gender pay gap. I'm now going to have a look at a range of other aspects of the way in which systemic racism shows up within the coaching ecosystem based on the testimonies of the coaches themselves. And here, what comes up in terms of the emotional content of these testimonies in relation to the need to acknowledge the presence of systemic racism is that coaching as a workplace is experienced as oppressive, as alienating, in a way that amplifies the trauma that is experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of colour, which is what BIPOC means. So when we use that acronym, that's what it means. Just from their daily lived experience in wider society, that coaching as a work context reflects and amplifies those experiences. So there's a long tail of trauma, a trauma that starts, it's intergenerational trauma, it goes through families, goes through communities, and it is reflected in the workplace. And I want to try and do what is possible for me to do as a presenter in a conference, which is not possible to do in a written report, which is to give you a sense of what it was like for me to interview these individuals, the kind of emotional context that came, the emotional quality, if you like, the emotional colour of their testimonies, as well as understanding the global and the national contexts which amplifies the emotional tone of those testimonies. So just pay some attention to who is speaking in this quotation. The woman speaking in this quotation is in her 60s. She's actually 60, she's a year younger than me. She has 15 years coaching experience. She's qualified, credentialed. She's traveled abroad to get training. She actually came to the UK to get some of her training. So she takes her profession very seriously. She grew up under the system of apartheid. For those of you in the audience too young to remember apartheid, it was a legalized form of segregation which separated white and black people. They had to use different facilities, live in different parts of the country. The black population was impoverished and the white highly privileged and wealthy. That regime was ended through a popular struggle led by the indigenous people of South Africa. And despite the ending of that legal form of racist structure in society, legalized form of racism, there are still practices that carry the emotional tone of that previous regime. Just take a look at her words. And I would like to focus you on one particular section of this testimony in particular. She says, I need to take my white colleague into corporate environments with me if I am to be heard. She says they can hear more a white person than they can hear a black person. She has to be introduced into the still predominantly white management structure of these corporate environments because she's not allowed entry in her own right on the basis of her own qualifications, her own experience, her own expertise and competence. I just take a moment to feel the emotional pain that must bring, the humiliation, and the dehumanization. For the next quote, I'd like to take us to the United States of America. This is a black male coach. Again, he's in his 50s, qualified. He works in a university department, trains coaches. He's on coaching pools. He's one of the rare, few black men in corporate coaching spaces. And this quote expresses his reason for wanting to be involved in this research. Because his experience of being a black male in America is that black men, just look at the second part of this quotation, are studied, are hunted, are feared, and really rarely probed intellectually. That is seen as a source of professional expertise. Underrepresentation is not just a question of numbers. It's also a question of the day-to-day attrition of not being seen, not being recognized. And if you challenge, you're met with, as this participant says, an embarrassed silence. So we're now in the UK. This is a female coach of Indian heritage. She runs a business, or actually was running a business at the time when I interviewed her, and was due to shut that business down because she wasn't able to get corporates to purchase her services. And what was the service that she was trying to engage these corporates in? Providing access to a black coach, a coach of color, who could work with black middle leaders in order to enable them to get access to senior leadership roles. Another aspect of the systemic and disproportionate allocation of leadership roles to Black and people of colour, this is a common way in which structural and systemic racism shows up in the workplace. So they're underrepresented at those higher levels in leadership. Now, she was offering her services to try and remedy this. And all she got when she asked these questions about coaching pools, about coaching panels, was an embarrassed silence. And the point that she makes about this is that it increases a sense of isolation, marginalization, and in the end actually meant that she wasn't able to offer her services and run her business. So let's now go to the second challenge, which is to end the current collusive neutrality of colour blindness, which we suggest in our report and present evidence to show is the case, that there is colourblind attitude that dominates across the coaching industry. So what is the cost of that to BIPOC coaches? First of all, they see that the material reality of their existence in a racialized society is that it is ignored. That material reality is seen as immaterial, non-existent, and not given validity. The other thing it does is to ignore the complexity of identity and the way in which they have been racialized, and their resistance to that racialization becomes a part of their identity. Research shows that a positive racial identity for both white and Black people, Black and white people, is a protective factor for BIPOC people. It enables them to challenge and to thrive in contexts where they experience racism. And for white people, the studies show that it actually helps them to come to terms with whiteness and what whiteness has come to mean in a context of racialized, racial hierarchy, where higher value is given to whiteness and less value is given to Blackness. It helps them to develop a sense of themselves in terms of their ability to challenge and take an anti-racist stance, which in itself does raise a number of complex and uncomfortable issues. So let's explore this aspect of the data in relation to identity a bit more. This participant, again, we're back in South Africa, in this quotation is relating her experience of raising the colour blindness of her coach training experience as a participant in the training. She's raising this issue with the trainer, and this is her, if you like, her record, her record of that conversation. She challenges the coach trainer that if she does not see colour, the coach trainer says, well, I don't see colour. She says, you can't not see colour, it's part of who I am. People who use that statement, I don't see colour, just are unable to deal with the discomforts to do with having conversations about race. The way she puts it here is that they're tiptoeing around white fragility. And this participant emphasizes the importance for coaches to be able to have these conversations, to be able to invite their clients into these conversations and provide a safe place specifically for Black and clients of colour to speak about their experiences when they need to, that are within the context of racialized workplaces. How can a coach make a connection with people whose sense of self, sense of being able to make progress is hampered by a racialized workplace if the coach is not able to have these conversations and understand and empathize with those coaches? And now I'd like to move to New Zealand and to our Maori participants. Here we have the post-colonial context of an Indigenous people who have been deprived of their land, of their cultural identity, their culture regarded as primitive, and an attitude towards them, which I'll come to in the second quote, that they're responsible for their own problems, which is a typical sort of neoliberal approach to disadvantage and a failure to thrive. So in this quotation, we have an expression by this Maori coach who was trained within the context of a business school, that she has a sort of cynicism about corporate coaching. And her cynicism is to do with the fact that she doesn't feel that the coaching is, that the issue of the Maori people is recognised, is seen, that they are coached in terms of performance, but not coached in terms of their whole self. And this she doesn't even feel is coaching at all. And this comes across most strongly in the second quotation. She believes there's a sense of paternalism in the way that coaching is taught, that there's a sentiment that the Maori are to blame for their own problems, and if they only worked harder, they could lift themselves from the social and economic mire in which they are trapped. But the point that she makes here is that there are systemic barriers to that, and an inability to recognise those entrapments, those systemic barriers, means that actually you're not fit for purpose as a coach in coaching these individuals. So in relation to the third challenge, we need a system-wide response to the ways in which systemic racism is reflected within our industry. We need a movement to drive that change, and we are inviting you into that movement. And we need to build a culture of accountability. To that end, I'm just going to jump forward a little bit, I'm just looking at time. To that end, we spoke to, as Jonathan said, professional associations and other key stakeholders in the coaching world. And we sorted their responses into essentially two groups along a continuum from reactive to proactive. The professional associations representatives from the global north were predominantly in a sort of denial position. They were unable to see the fact that we were talking about systemic racism, not individual attitudes, and push back with "we are not racist." So there was a position of denial there. Now, while we recognise there is a shift taking place in that response to issues of diversity, inclusion and belonging in the coaching ecosystem, that movement is still slow and needs to be accelerated. In terms of the trainers and coach service providers that Jonathan interviewed, there was an acknowledgement of an issue, specifically in relation to underrepresentation in coaching pools. But the point that was made there is that when they advertise for coaches, Black coaches don't come forward. Now, if you put on your systemic lens, what you would ask then is, well, what are the reasons that might explain that? What structures, what patterns, what practices might actually hold back Black coaches from applying for corporate coaching pools? Now, there is one specific thing that I'd like to highlight here. If Black and coaches of colour are not getting into executive positions in corporates, they're unlikely to develop the criterion that is required to be in a coaching pool that says you need to have experience in in an executive role in a corporate context in order to coach executives. So there you have a perfect example of that cycle of cause and effect, which puts the onus back onto the black coat without recognizing that actually there's a systemic issue here that needs to be addressed in the way that we recruit, the processes we use to recruit, and a look taken at the criterion by which we judge leadership experience. So we want to shift the responses to the proactive zone, to create a commitment to change. And our report makes 15 recommendations, and Jonathan will take us through those in a moment. I would just like to end with this quotation, which emphasizes our responsibility to take an ethical stand in relation to systemic racism as it shows up in our profession, and make it a core aspect of our professional identity.
Charmaine, thank you very much indeed. And you've brought alive the research that we've been gathering and brought those voices to us. I think that they are moving and were impactful on how we started to think about what did we as individuals, what did we as a coaching community need to do? And that led us to a series of recommendations, an invitation for you as individuals to make a series of commitments. We thought it was appropriate, recognizing the different stakeholders across our ecosystem, that the recommendations should be clustered under those different groups. So the first of those recommendations really relates to the wider global coaching community. And we talk about how we as a community need to be taking action. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about what you as an individual could potentially do to take forward this issue. We also made some recommendations about coach educators. What do private sector and university providers engaged in accredited and credentialed programs need to be taking in relation to action with respect to program content, but also thinking about the makeup of the students who they're attracting and also the makeup of the staff who are engaged in teaching these programs. How do we create a sense of greater engagement and a sense of greater diversity when we look at the contents of that curriculum? The third set of recommendations relates to coach service providers. And Charmaine's already talked a little bit about some of the voices that have come forward there. So some recommendations for coach service providers to help them think through the actions that they might be taking. Now, they may be small organizations that might have half a dozen coaches that they're providing in a particular state or a city, or they might be global providers who need to be thinking seriously about their approach, not at a global level, although that is important, but thinking about at a national and a city level. How do they respond in those individual contexts, recognizing how race plays out is different in those contexts. It's different in the United States to how it's playing out in Nigeria. It's different in Korea to how it might play out in South Africa or in New Zealand. So having a national based approach might help us begin to move forward. The fourth set of the recommendations relate to professional bodies, and for professional bodies, chapters and global bodies to think about their response to these issues. And then our fifth set of recommendations are us and the roles that we play as coaches, as mentors, and as supervisors. What are the actions that we might be taking when we adopt those different roles and the relationships that we might have with our mentees, with our clients, and with our supervisees? And then last of all, our recommendations are about the wider industry leaders and what we collectively need to do in relation to our voice to take forward this issue with some positive actions. So we'd first of all invite you to read the report, and I'm going to share with you in a moment or two how you can get access to the report, to download it. But a first step is to encounter the report, look at the evidence, think about what that might mean in terms of the recommendations and the actions that you might choose to commit to take in the roles that you play, maybe as a leader, as a coach, as a mentor, as a supervisor, as a trainer. The second step that we're inviting you to consider is to share the report. Now, we recognize there might be 100 or there might be 300 people connecting in to this particular session. We want to create a movement for change. 100 of us, if we pass that on to 3 people in our network, can create 300 people. If they pass it on to 3 people that they know and engaging with the report, we're very quickly beginning to spread out this message and getting people to start thinking about what are the implications for their practice? What is the work that they need to do in terms of personal change? What is the work that they could do in those different roles that they play? And gradually through that ripple effect, spreading out across the pond of our industry. The third invitation to you is to, having engaged with the report, having disseminated or shared with 3 other people in your network and asking them to do the same, is to discuss it in your chapter group, in your next supervision session, in maybe the next mentoring session that you do, in the next peer networking group. And think about that group in the context of those people who are coming together. What are the implications of this report for you in your role and for that group of individuals who are coming together? And then, of course, like all great programs of behavioral change, we'd like you just to put a little reminder in your diary for 1 month's time from the date of you listening to this session, and ask yourself, what actions have you taken to bring this about in change for your own practice and the role that you play as a coach, as a supervisor, as a mentor, as an industry leader? Because only when we collectively act together to drive forward this agenda will we see real change delivered across our system to bring about the structural change that we've talked about in relation to this research report. So you can access the full report through our platforms on ResearchGate. You may have access to that, or you can access it through Coach Hub, or you can access the report for free as well at Henley Business School. Any of those locations, download a full copy of the report, engage with it, start to think about what it might mean in relation to your practice. And of course, you can also connect with Charmaine and I. Here are our LinkedIn accounts. We'd be delighted to hear from you, hear about your response to the report, hear about your thoughts about the work that you need to do, the work that you're committed to take. And we would ask you to join with us on taking action in relation to addressing the challenge that this research has identified. Charmaine, let me hand over to you for the final word.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning in to this session. There will be a Q&A, and I hope you'll stay on to ask some questions. I'll be there to respond to your questions, and we look forward to working alongside you in continuing this work and creating this shift. Thank you very much for listening.